All right, hello everyone. I hope you all enjoyed the fantastic lunch here at Pederinos. I know I always enjoy it. My name is Jim Lakely. I'm the Communications Director at the Heartland Institute. And again, I want to welcome you all here to our latest installment of Heartland's Author Series. I see a lot of new faces here, so I wanted to talk a little bit about what the Heartland Institute is all about. We're a libertarian free market think tank that is looking for free market solutions to social and economic problems in the United States. We deal exclusively just with domestic policy in the areas of education, budgets and taxes, healthcare, the environment, technology, and finance, insurance, and real estate. You can see all of the stuff that we do if you go to heartland.org in our brand new redesigned website. You should be able to click through and see all the things that we're doing this week, last week. It's very much up to date, and I hope that you will check that out. We'll also have a new iPad app out in about a week or so. The application itself has been submitted to iTunes, and we have our fingers crossed that it'll all be approved shortly. So that's a lot of fun. And we also have a new digital magazine called The Heartlander, and you'll see a link to that at heartland.org. That's a compiling of the 6 public policy newspapers that we produce on those topic areas that I had mentioned. So if you want the best of latest breaking news from a free market perspective, the Heartlander is the place to go. A few upcoming events that we have coming up very soon on the schedule is our 27th anniversary benefit dinner. That's on Thursday, October 13th, where you can join hundreds of like-minded lovers of liberty for an evening of fun and fellowship and dinner and drinks and lots of laughs. Also a silent auction, and as of now, a mystery keynote address, so stay tuned. That's all coming very soon. Yes, Dave, mystery. That makes me feel better to say it that way. Also, that same day on October 13th is our Emerging Issues Forum. We had a state representative here. He just had to leave, unfortunately, but he's also coming to the Emerging Issues Forum, which is focused toward legislators, and it's run by our Government Relations Department. Our Government Relations Department, their task is to communicate these free market ideas to state legislators mainly, so that they can better run their states. It's kind of counterintuitive trying to teach a legislator to have less government in his state. But you'd be surprising how receptive some people are to that, to putting more free market principles into the way state governments and policy is run. And all the information for all these events, again, can be found at heartland.org. There's also a donate button there for the new people in the room. Without the support of people like you and coming to events like this, we can't do events like this and be so effective in our outreach in advancing the free market principles that I'm sure we all hold dear. So there is a donate button there that you'll also see at the top. And with that, I would like to introduce our featured speaker, Rich Trzupek. He is a chemist, a consultant at Mustardi Platt Environmental, and a writer. In 25 years of professional practice, Rich has worked with several Fortune 500 companies, community groups, and even the Environmental Protection Agency itself. At the EPA, Rich helped to develop test methods and regulations, and he's also served as a lecturer to regulators, industry, and students about environmental topics. And on that background, one gets the feeling that Rich had a book screaming to come out after all of that. In addition to the book that he will discuss today, Regulators Gone Wild, How the EPA is Ruining American Industry, Rich is the author of McGraw-Hill's Air Quality Permitting and Compliance Manual, and also an Encounter Books broadside titled How the EPA's Green Tyranny is Stifling America. A longtime critic of well-heeled extremist environmental groups and their media enablers, which with he and Heartland now share a lot in common, Rich has written extensively about environmental and science topics, as well as other current affairs. He's been a columnist for Examiner Publications, a chain of suburban newspapers in the northern suburbs of Chicago, for over 10 years. His op-eds have appeared in the Chicago Tribune, the Northwest Indiana Times, Creighton Chicago Business, and other media outlets. Rich was named a Phillips Foundation Fellow in 2004, and he also contributes to frontpagemag.com, Threedonia.com, and to also Andrew Breitbart's Big Sites, most prominently Big Journalism, I believe. And Big Government, do you do them too?
Sometimes.
Sometimes. It's hard to imagine Regulators Gone Wild, how the EPA is running American industry, being more timely than it is right now. Rich reveals in this book the inside story of how the green movement and big government have united to stifle American productivity and hamstring innovation, and by design, not really by accident. The book explains, as I'm sure Rich will in his talk, how the EPA has lost focus on cleaning up the environment and has turned into a mindless, power-hungry bureaucracy that institutes economy-crushing rules that give the public very little environmental benefit, something you and I just discussed at lunch today. Regulators Gone Wild explains how the EPA's policies sometimes actually do harm to the environment, while the opportunity cost to American industry is high, and the threats of regulation and the hidden secret costs, secret of our environmental life, which is that our environment has actually never been cleaner, and yet the EPA keeps trying to get a little better, a little better, a little better, and to what benefit? So I'm not going to say that anymore. Richard Trzupek is. Please welcome Rich Trzupek.
Well, thanks, Jim, and thank you very much, Heartland in general, Diane and Joe and everybody. I really can't say enough about how much I admire Heartland Institute and the work that it does and how important it is, especially right now with the state of the economy and the decision point we've all reached in terms of where we're going politically. So I'm really a big fan of Heartland's. Jim gave you the commercial for the book, so I'm going to largely avoid the commercial. It's full of not only the broader policy issues, but also experiences which I think you'll find quite remarkable from my years as a consultant to industry and working with different people in industry. But what I'd like to talk about today is kind of the bigger picture in terms of where we are environmentally and what the EPA does and where we're going. So with that, let's start. And I'll start with a question. What is this person? This is Lisa Jackson, Director of the US EPA. And she'll kind of stand for everything the EPA is, okay? What does she have in common with this guy? And that, of course, would be teen geek icon Napoleon Dynamite. Anybody? Okay, let's go. Self-esteem issues. Because that's really where we are with the EPA today, is they really have a self-esteem issue. Consider in 1971, it was really cool to be an environmentalist. The Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act had just got passed. And we needed it, because the Cuyahoga River was burning. We actually had smokestacks where we had black smoke pouring out of them. And according to Raquel Carson, all the birds were going to die. So everybody strapped on their Birkenstocks and went to work. 40 years later, here's the Cuyahoga River today. It's sportsman's paradise, according to the website. You can't find the black smokestacks anymore. They don't exist. So what the media is reduced to doing is showing pictures like this where it's actually steam. And we are overrun with frickin' geese. It's a much different world. How did we get here? Well, there's a whole lot of data. The EPA is good about one thing more than anything else, and that's tabulating data. I'm just going to show you a small fraction. But if the press ever did their job, which would be going and finding source data when it comes to the environment, instead of listening to the parrots in their ear from the environmental industry, they could easily find this themselves and tell a much different story than the one they tell today. So let's just look at a little bit of air data, because I'm primarily an air guy, or an airhead if you prefer. Since the start of the Clean Air Act, that's carbon monoxide emissions, 62% reduction since 1970. And, hit it, today, the vast majority of it has nothing to do with industry. It has nothing to do with smokestacks. Next one. Particulate emissions. You hear crying about particulate emissions, and we're all dying, we're all getting asthma because of particulate emissions, right? Well, somebody needs to explain to me how asthma rates can be going up for the last 40 years while particulate emissions, which supposedly cause it, have been going down and down and down for the same time period. Now this one you might note, if somebody's going to quibble, we're starting at 1985 because that represents the year when they changed the way they tabulated particulate emissions. So if we went back to 1970, the reduction would be even bigger. But starting at 85, the reduction over 60%, and the vast majority of it has nothing to do with smokestacks anymore. Next one. NOx emissions. Again, a massive reduction. And you'll notice that, remember Bush, the worst environmental president in history? Notice how much of that reduction happened between 2000 and 2008 during the worst environmental president in history. And the majority of it is non-industrial. You can tell this story again and again in every media, that everything is cleaner, just like Jim said. It's cleaner air, cleaner water, less hazardous waste, more recycling, more wetlands. And the Louisiana Gulf Coast, since this is going to be on the web, is the exception, but that's a special case which I won't even get into. But even though everything's cleaner, and I think the majority of this audience, the sophisticated audience, would know that, there is still a great part of America that believes we are dirtier than ever, when nothing could be farther than the truth. And a great part of America that relies on this paradigm of the evil corporate polluter, that it's the evil corporate polluter who's causing the country to be so dirty. I got good news for you, or probably not for you guys, but for a lot of people. The evil corporate polluter doesn't exist anymore. It died 20 or 30 years ago. Corporations want to comply because they don't want their name sullied, they don't want their brand soiled by being labeled the environmental polluter. I have never dealt with anybody, and I deal with the people in the trenches at the factories, at the plant engineers and the EHS professionals and the plant managers. They all just say, just tell me what to do and I'll do it. We don't have any problem with compliance. And this idea that the left pushes that because we want better regulation, more efficient regulation, that we're for pollution is nonsense. Nobody is for pollution. We just want to manage it in an effective way. And besides all of that, the signature issue on the left, greenhouse gases emissions are down, hit it, 14% in the last decade. Now some of that is surely due to the economic downturn, we know that. But there is also a great body of regulations that are driving fossil fuel use down that is in place today and will continue to grow, and that number will continue to drop down. We're not quite at Kyoto yet, but we're going to get to Kyoto levels. And this is if they don't do anything with the carbon tax, if they don't do anything with cap and trade, which I think God is dead, it is still going to be driven down. And the nonsense that you hear that we need to do additional things to deal with the non-problem of global warming is crazy. They've won. They've got a whole infrastructure in place to continue to drive down our use of fossil fuels. So with all of those wonderful things that we've done, all that great reductions in emissions of all kind, do the environmentalists celebrate? Well, no. Every Earth Day is not, hey, good job, America. You spent all this money, you did all this cleanup. Every Earth Day is National Guilt Day. And the message is not celebrate, it's rather regulate. We always have to do more. Go ahead. Now, this one is just kind of an example of what I do, because I'm down in the trenches working with the regulations and helping, hopefully, the people who actually make money, who do something worthwhile, continue to do that. And the question that somebody asks a lot when they're building a new plant in this country is, okay, what do I have to do to comply? The answer to that would take longer than any of you could stay awake. So I'm just going to give you a portion of it, of what that answer looks like. First, you gotta get a construction permit. And then depending on the state you're in, you might need to get an operating permit. And you might be subject to prevention of significant deterioration regulations as well, which kind of factors into that, which means you have to employ best available control technology, except best available control technology is not really best, because if you're subject to non-attainment new source review, then you get lowest achievable emission reduction, which is better than best. In addition to that, you might be subject to national emission standards for hazardous air pollutants, in which case you have to also use maximum achievable control technology, which is a different definition again. You might be subject to new source performance standards, which implies different limits and different requirements. You might have state rules that are specific, that can be more stringent than the federal rules, and there's another bigger pile. If you live in a place like Chicago, you can have local rules, because you can have the city Department of Environment and Cook County rules to comply with. You might be subject to the Clean Air Interstate Rule right today, except that's going away and it's being replaced by the Transport Rule, which now has a third name, which I cannot remember. You might be in a regional trading program or a local trading program. You certainly will have to do emissions reports, and some of the data in the emissions report will also go into your toxic release inventory reports. And some of that data will also go into your Tier 2 reporting. And in addition to that, if you're in an area that's non-attainment for ozone, you probably have a seasonal report because the ozone season is a special thing and you have to get that data cranked through in a different way. And if you think all of this makes people tear their hair out, it does. Because that's a very small fraction of what people in industry have to deal with today. Who benefits from this giant mess of environmental regulations and how complex it is? Well, certainly the EPA benefits. I mean, it guarantees that they have a job, right? Environmental groups, they love that. And I'll take an aside here, the one, in that previous slide, the one little piece that said non-attainment new source review. Remember when under Bush, they wanted to reform that? And that's because that process is so complex and so painful. The environmental groups went nuts and they accused Bush of protecting his energy buddies. Now, two things. That reform effort was started under Clinton. It was started under the EPA under Bill Clinton. And two, reforming that process would not have changed emission limits one bit. It just would have made the process simpler. But environmental groups cannot stand the process getting simpler. They like it complex and long. The other person who benefits from all this mess is me. Because people have to come to me to figure out how to get through that maze. And quite frankly, one of the reasons I wrote Regulators Gone Wild is because I don't think I should have a job. My dad made steel. I push paper. It's silly. How do we evaluate US EPA performance? When I talked about Bush being, according to the left, the worst environmental president in history, surely they had some reason to say that. There must be some evidence. Well, it wasn't based on pollution. Pollution was not the metric that they used. It's based on enforcement. Bush's sin was that they had less enforcement actions under the Bush administration than under the Clinton administration or under the Obama administration. Now, we think about that for a minute. If you have less enforcement, you should have less enforcement as emissions drive down, as we've seen, right? As pollution decreases, people are getting better and better. Why would you have the same level of enforcement? And if you insist on the same level of enforcement, is that your metric? Well, then here's what happens. Less pollution, the same enforcement leads to what I call the more BS per dollar quotient, which is exactly where we are. And the message to industry that my clients are increasingly more frustrated with is, I'm doing better and better, but I'm under the same pressure. There's no reward for, according to EPA, for my performance. We'll take an aside and talk about greenhouse gas regulations for a minute, because I do want to go into that in more detail, because I don't think enough people understand it. I photoshopped that sticker, by the way, so I got skills. Let's talk about where we are with greenhouse gas regulation. We're going to do it in two parts. One, go ahead, is greenhouse gas regulation BO, which is before Obama, because we did have it. We have one, renewable portfolio standard programs in 33 states right now. RPS programs are state programs that require the state to use less and less fossil fuel every year to generate electricity. So for instance, in Illinois, I think right now the RPS is about, what, 3%? And by 2025, or whatever the year is, it's got to get to 25%. So those programs are going to mean that we are going to emit less and less greenhouse gases every year by design. And that's happening, and that's in place, and that's not going to change that I can see. We also have regional cap and trade. On the East Coast, we have what's called RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, that's been in place for a couple of years already. And the Midwest and the Western Climate Initiatives, they're still working on putting trading programs together. And aside on the Western Climate Initiative, it was originally called the Western Greenhouse Gas Initiative, until somebody figured out that the acronym would be WGGI. And that was a little too close to the truth, so they moved on. Go ahead. Public incentive programs, well, you guys know we have those. That's what funds the wind industry to a great extent, is the subsidies and the tax breaks, and the solar industry. I've had people from energy companies tell me quite unofficially that, you know, the price of wind power is so expensive that once the subsidies run out, they run the windmills till they break and then they're done with them. But there's really no private sector incentive to run windmills. Greenhouse gas regulations after Obama. After Obama. It's interesting how this administration has gone after fossil fuels by doing what I would consider end arounds, by kind of indirect regulation. They didn't get cap and trade, but really they got everything else. NAAQS stands for National Ambient Air Quality Standards, and that's how much of a particular pollutant is allowed to be in the air. Well, if you clamp down on those standards for NO2 and SO2, which are produced when you burn coal, if you clamp down on them enough, you can make it impossible to build a new coal plant of any great size, which is what they've done. The new NO2 NAAQS in particular is so small that whenever you do the modeling of a new coal plant's emissions, you violate the NAAQS, and the Clean Air Act says you can't build a plant if you're going to violate a NAAQS. So it was a very good way of making sure that you could build no more coal plants. The new ozone NAAQS, you probably saw the president decided to defer. It's not dead, it's just deferred. If he gets re-elected, he's going to look at it again in 2013. And that one I think is especially economically disastrous for a variety of reasons. But I won't go into all of that yet. But it's at least deferred for now. We also have a lot of greenhouse gas reporting, greenhouse gas rules under the Clean Air Act, CAA. We've got the reporting rule that's in place now. Big emitters of greenhouse gases are required to go through the permit process, and that permit process does imply control and standards. It means you have to meet certain emission limits, and the EPA is looking at energy efficiency as being the primary standard they're going to use when evaluating greenhouse gas emissions. So what that means is, if you're looking at energy efficiency, the EPA now gets deeper and deeper into the operations of the plant. Don't do it this way, do it that way, because we think that's more energy efficient. And of course, we've got new CAFE standards coming out. Go ahead. Also in the attack on coal, we have new utility and boiler MACs, which stands for Maximum Achievable Control Technology Standards. These are supposed to really deal with hazardous air pollutants, but in fact, the way they're written is just another way to kind of clamp down on coal. You divide the world between existing units, which have tough standards, but I think achievable, and then you have standards for new coal facilities, which are basically impossible. As one person in the industry put it, to build a new coal plant, you would have to use all the energy from the coal plant to run the pollution control devices you'd need to run the coal plant. Small units, like municipal boilers that burn coal and co-ops, kind of the message there that the EPA is carrying is, nice plant you got there, it'd be a shame if anything happened to it. So here's your choice. You can shut down, or you can switch to biomass. But if you keep burning coal, we are going to come at you with all kind of PSD violation and PSD requests that are going to cost you so much money you're not going to want to run your plant anyway. Probably 30 to 50 gigawatts of baseload coal is going to shut down in the next 10 to 15 years, is what the energy industry is saying. The only way to replace that, because we're talking base power, you can't do wind for baseload power anyway. So the only way you're going to replace that is with natural gas. Assuming they don't screw up the natural gas industry, which is booming in this country right now, you're going to have relatively cheap natural gas, more expensive than coal. And the only way you can get that much power up quickly is by putting in gas turbines in, which means GE wins on both ends of the equation. GE wins because they build the windmills, GE wins because they build the gas turbines. So it's probably a good time to invest in GE right now. To sum up, the old problem with the EPA, in my opinion, was that it was over-intrusive, and it really wasn't focused, over the last 10, 20 years so much on emission reductions as creating a maze of gotchas that really interfere with industry. The new EPA problems, in my opinion, have gotten even worse because we do have these unrealistic expectations for many emission limits. The backhand regulations, and really justifying their mission. has become such a focus for the EPA. And I want to make it clear that as an industry guy, nobody is for more pollution. That's not the issue here. And I don't think the left should be able to grab onto this issue of overregulation and say that we are all for a dirtier world, we're all for more pollution. That's not it. That's not the problem. It's this stuff that's the problem. It's the poking your nose into everything that's the problem. The EPA is on the defensive now, for the first time in a long time, I think. And you'll see these talking points. What's good for the government is good for the economy, according to Lisa Jackson. Environmental regulations save lives. And Republicans are anti-science. I've seen that one a number of times. And according to Lisa Jackson, regulations are a 4,000% return on investment. Now, I'm not a business guy, but I think if something offered a 4,000% return on investment, you wouldn't need government to tell you to do it. I'm just saying. The way the EPA calculates those monetary savings, by the way, is mainly in deaths avoided. So for every new regulation, they figure out how many theoretical lives will be extended, and then they put a monetary value to that. And if you add up all of those deaths avoided, I think we're all immortal. Go ahead. So, you know, a call from many on the right is get rid of the EPA. I understand it's a talking point. I don't think that's the way to go. I don't think it's realistic, and I think ultimately it's probably counterproductive. The EPA, I think, does serve a function, or should serve a function, of making sure that the playing field is level. Because, well, in my opinion, in my experience, 95% of all of my clients have always wanted to comply. There are a few, and it's usually the little guys who are looking for an edge and who would gladly, you know, work their way around and pollute just because that would give them an edge over some big guy. So keeping the playing field level, I think, is important. Moving the goalposts back all the time, though, is a completely different matter. And that's what the agency does. So if you want to reform the EPA, I think job one would be stop letting them define their own mission. Stop letting them say, well, we've met this standard, which we told you 10 years ago was going to define clean, but you know what? We think we need to be a little cleaner. At some point, they have to have an end game defined. A friend of mine who's a good businessman told me, you know, if looking at this, he says, if you go into a distressed business, the first thing you ask is, what's your end game? And the answer for EPA is there is no end game. It goes on forever and ever and ever. At some point, Congress, I think, has to step in, take EPA's ability to define its own mission away from them, and decide what our goals are going to be and when we go into what I would consider a maintenance mode. If not now, then tell me when. Tell me how clean is clean. Don't keep redefining clean. I think the idea that, look at the last one, we don't look at risk versus reward analysis by Supreme Court rule is ridiculous. You're not allowed, according to the court, to consider economics when looking at making new rules, environmental rules. I think that's silly because it allows EPA to continue moving the goalposts, and it pretends that there's not a health effect associated with economic issues, and there certainly is. So I don't know how this is done. I'm not an attorney, but risk versus reward, which we're now prevented from doing when it comes to environmental topics, seems to be something that we need to be able to do in the future. We certainly have a lot of duplicative regulations, especially when it comes to reporting and record keeping and all the rest, and I think those really can be consolidated way down. The permitting process needs to be streamlined. The fact that for certain projects it can take literally years to get a permit really hurts American business in ways that I think people don't understand. When it takes that long to do a project, the capital is going to go somewhere else, and that's just free market 101. And stop using enforcement as a metric. The only metric that EPA's performance should be based on is amount of pollution, state of the environment, not enforcement actions. And I think if we do all that, then we'll hit my dream of putting me out of a job. And I think that was it. Yep.